All right, Rabosai, good morning. Good morning. Aschos Baruch Hashem to be back here with all of you. A tremendous thank you to Rabbi Shmuel for giving the shir over the last number of days. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Tammuz, Daniel and Batsheva Pava of Hashmonaim, Yisrael, in commemoration of the first Yahrzeit of their father, Reb Shlomo ben Yehuda Aryeh, Vegh of Philadelphia. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, his neshama have an aliya and the family a neshama. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Gregg and Rachel Levitan from Yisrael, in memory of Rachel's father, Burton, Schreiber, Bentzion, Ben Yisrael, Shimon, and Aunt Maxine, Bas Yisrael, Shimon, Zichron, B'rach. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, the neshama have an aliya and the families a neshama. And with that, let us begin. Baruch Hashem, a lot to do today, a really incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Lamed Aleph 31. And we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on the top of Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph 31a at the two dots. It's nice in Basra to have some shorter dapping that are a little bit more, as even though Richter was giving the share, I was trying to record it also just for my own chazara. And it was incredible. It felt like 2 cycles ago and I was able to finish the daf in like 32 minutes. So I was like, wow, I haven't done this in ages. All right, let's go. So we are continuing again in the sugya of really competing claims. So it's a really interesting cases over here. So Reuven says, this field belongs to my forefathers. And Shimon says, this field belongs to my forefathers. Now, just to illustrate the way this case works, look at Rashi. So just to understand. So let's call it like this. Shimon's living on this land. Reuven comes along and says, Shimon, this is my land. This is my land. This land belonged to my forefathers. And Shimon says, this land belonged to my forefathers. Okay, so they're both making the same exact claim. Now just understand, it's Shimon who's living on this field right now. So the Gemara says, V'hai aisi sahadi da'achli shnei chazaka. So what happens? Now Shimon, let's say Shimon goes ahead, and Shimon brings witnesses that he has utilized this field for the 3 years. He's utilized the field for the time necessary to go ahead and use and create chazaka, but he doesn't have witnesses that belong to his forefathers. So that's what's happening. So Shimon brings witnesses. So again, one more time. Reuven claims, this is my father's field. Shimon, get out of here. Shimon says, this is my father's field. That's why I'm living here. Reuven brings witnesses to say that to support his claim. Shimon doesn't bring witnesses to support his claim that it's his father's field, but he does bring witnesses to say that he's been living there for 3 years. So Shimon has witnesses that he's been living there the years of Chazaka. Reuven has witnesses that the field belonged to his father. So what's the halacha? Amar Rabba says, Malo the shaker. So Rabba says we should believe Shimon. Why? Why should Shimon lie? Now what does that mean? Why should Shimon lie? Shimon didn't have to make a claim that the field belonged to my father. Right? What could Shimon have said? Listen, remember, we'll say, what does Shimon have going for him? Right? He's been living there. Right? He has been living there, and he has witnesses to support the fact that he's been there for the years of Chazaka. So remember again from like a couple of days ago, remember we learned, Chazaka by itself is not enough. Chazaka has to be accompanied by a taina. You have to make a claim. So Shimon could have made a much easier claim. What could the claim have been? Reuven, I bought the field from you, and I've been living here for 3 years. That's it. That's the claim. He didn't have to make a claim that this field belonged to my forefathers. So Rabbi said, this is called malo l'shaker, mali l'shaker. Why should I lie? When a person makes a particular claim, even if they can't support that claim, but they could have made an even more believable claim, it almost lends support to their unsubstantiated claim. Okay? In other words, I'm sorry? It's a type of migo. Correct. So Rabbi says, okay, I understand. Shimon can't produce witnesses that the field belonged to his father. But Lamaisa, he didn't ever have to make that claim at all. He could have just said, I bought this field from you, and I lived here for the years of Chazaka, and I have witnesses that support to live here for the years of Chazaka. So Rabbi says, therefore we should believe Shimon. Okay? So Abai says, no. Mali the shakir b'makom edim lo amrinan. So first Abai says, we don't do that. In other words, we'll say, you have to understand something. Shimon's claim is refuted. How is Shimon's claim refuted? Because Reuven produced witnesses that said that the field belonged to his forefathers. So once Reuven produces that level of testimonial support, and Shimon doesn't have that, so Shimon's claim is refuted. Right? So in other words, Shimon's claiming it belonged to my forefathers. Okay, prove it. Reuven's claiming the field belonged to my forefathers, and Reuven is doing witnesses. So we don't say mali l'shaker, right? We don't go ahead and essentially support Shimon's unsubstantiated claim simply because he could have made a more believable claim when that unsubstantiated claim is refuted by someone else's witnesses. So therefore, again, machlokes Abaye and Rabba. So the Gemara says, "Hadar Amrlei." Israel says, "Okay, so now the case is this isn't what's the lashon? An evolving story, right? This is an evolving story, right? So stage one of the story is Shimon's living on the field. Reuven comes along and says, Shimon, get out of here. This field belongs to my forefathers. Shimon says, funny you should say that because this field belonged to my forefathers. So they come to Bezdin. Jews have disputes, let's bring it to Bezdin. Reuven brings witnesses that the field belonged to his forefathers. Shimon brings witnesses that he's been living there for 3 years uncontested. Okay, so now we'll say, so now, what do we do with that? So in this first iteration, Rabbah says we should believe Shimon, because Shimon could have made an easier claim that you sold me the field and I've been living there the years of Chazak, and he would have been believed. So since he could have made that other claim, but instead he decided to say it belonged to my forefathers, you should believe him, right? Mali l'shaker. Rabbi Abaye says absolutely not. We don't believe that claim. In other words, essentially Shimon's claim has been disproved because Reuven brought witnesses that the field belonged to his forefathers, and Shimon cannot bring similar witnesses. So we don't say Mali l'shakir b'makom eidim. Okay, story evolves. Hadar, listen to this. Shimon comes along and Shimon says, you know what, you're right. In da'avasachi. Listen to this. So Shimon says, you know what, Reuven, you're right. This field did belong to your forefathers. Vizabanta minach. And I bought it from them. Wow. Okay. So Shimon says, you're right. You're right, Reuven. I'm Modeh. The field belonged to your forefathers. We all agree. And I bought it from them. So I would say, we have a little itty-bitty problem, which is, so then Shimon lied, right? Shimon said it belonged to his forefathers. So how does Shimon explain his original claim? And that which I claimed that the field belonged to my forefathers, this field is as embedded in my family as if it belonged to my forefathers. This guy's good, right? So Shimon's good. So I say, so now Shimon comes along again. Part two of this story. So now again, Shimon says, you're right, Reuven. You're right. You know why I didn't bring witnesses to support my claim that it belonged to my forefathers? Because it didn't belong to my forefathers. It belonged to your forefathers. I bought it from your forefathers. So why did I claim in Bentzion that it belonged to my forefathers? Because it's so embedded in my mishpacha. The sale was so concrete. And it's been in my family now for all of these years, 3 to be exact, right? That Lamaisa, it's as if it belonged to my forefathers. So now, in part 2 of this story, Shimon is revisiting and editing his chayos. It's interesting. You know, like on WhatsApp, you have this now. I don't know if it's a new feature. I just discovered this. Edit, right? You can edit. But it's interesting. I don't know why they do this. You can see when someone edited their message. I don't know what the pshat what that is. I think it's a good musar. I think that the musar that WhatsApp is trying to teach us is, maybe be a little bit more careful the first time. In other words, someone's going to see, right? You're going to see it. You're like, It's kind of like when somebody erases a message, right? You're like, wow, what was that? I wish I could have seen that before they erased it, right? But Lamaisa also at the edited. Like, I'm curious, what exactly was the first version of that message? So we'll say, so it's interesting over here. So Shimon's coming along, and Shimon's editing his original claim. Okay, so now what do we do this? So the Gemara says, this is fascinating. So the Gemara says, Toin v'chozer v'toin, o ein toin v'chozer v'toin. Shabbos says, so now we come to a fundamental, incredible yisodistic machlokes. When a person makes a legal claim, can they go ahead and essentially edit that claim, revisit that claim, modify that claim, or not? That's called toin. I made a claim, the chozer v'toin, and then can I modify my claim? Can I go back and say, one second, let me clarify and modify, and maybe even change what I said? Or eino chozer v'toin, or no? Once you make a claim in Bezdin, that's it. You're locked in. You cannot revisit that again. So this is a machlokes. So says, here we go. So now remember, this is this case. So now Shimon's coming along and saying, you're right. My forefathers didn't own it. Reuven, your forefathers owned it, but I bought it from them. But it says solidly embedded in my mishpacha as if my forefathers owned it. So now, what do we do with this claim, this new claim of Shimon? So machlokes. Here we go. Ula Amar Toin v'chozer v'toin. Ula says you are permitted in Beis Din to revisit your claim. Okay, now it doesn't automatically mean that Beis Din is going to believe you, right? But lamaisa, you have the right. You have the right to say, I would like to further explain or like to modify that which I said before. But say, take a look at Rashi. Ula Amar Toin v'chozer v'toin. It's like a cross in Rashi about 6 lines down. Ula Amar Toin v'chozer v'toin. Toin beBeis Din mashu rotza. So a person makes a taina, makes a claim in Beis Din. The chozer acharechein liton dvarim acherim litaritz dvarim harishonim afa pisha machishim ktsas zebazeh shechazer v'tan. So we'll say, so again, so Ula says like this: a person makes a claim in Beis Din, and then a person is believed to clarify or to modify that claim, even though the modification somewhat contradicts the original claim, as long as what? As long as they can explain the rationale for the modification. We accept, in other words, again, I want to say, accept it doesn't mean that we're actually going to believe it, but accept it means that we allow the litigant to do it. We allow the litigant to do it. Will we accept it? Will we believe it? Okay, that remains to be seen. But we at least allow for the process. Toing the chozer v'toing. The Nardoim said, absolutely not. Eno toin v'chozer v'toin. Absolutely not. Halacha l'maaseh, again, once you make your claim in Beis Din, that's your claim. It's locked in. There's nothing more to talk about. Okay, you want to say you lied. You have the right to say that you lied, but there's no such thing as coming back and saying, I didn't really mean that. I really meant this. And especially, again, the modification is going to go. Now, again, I will say, is there room for clarifications? Certainly room for clarifications, but a clarification is different than a modification, right? In this case over here, what Shimon is saying is, really, the words that I used before were not correct. It did not really belong to my forefathers. I bought it from Reuven's forefathers, but it's ki'ilu, it's been in my family for generations. Okay, so that is a modification which contradicts, to a certain degree, Shimon's initial claim. Ula says, we'll take it, toin v'chozer v'toin, and Ardai says ultimately again, no, toin v'eno chozer v'toin, or say, eno toin v'chozer v'toin. Once you've lodged your statement, you can't modify it. Okay, so let's analyze this. Umodi ula hecha da amarle shalavosai v'lo shalavosecha de'eno toin v'chozer v'toin. So listen, now watch this. This is fascinating. Even Ula, who normally says toin v'chozer v'toin, that you can go back and modify previously made statements, agrees in the following case. If Shimon were to come to Beis Din, and Shimon initially were to say, right, so Reuven is claiming, Shimon, get off my land, it belonged to my forefathers. And Shimon were to say, excuse me, Reuven, this land belonged to my forefathers and not your forefathers. So I was supposed to say, see the difference between this claim and the original claim? In the original claim, we're talking about what was Shimon's claim? Right? This belonged to my forefathers. Okay, so Ula says, fine, there's room for Shimon to come back and say, I didn't literally mean it belonged to my forefathers. I meant it belonged to your forefathers. I bought it from them, but it's ki'ilu, it belonged to my forefathers. Right? That's how embedded it is in my mishpacha. But if Shimon were to say, this land only belonged to my forefathers, not your forefathers, that is too much of an explicit and declarative statement to go back and edit. So in other words, even Ula, who says toin v'chozer v'toin, just remember that phrase I will say. Even Ula, who says that you can make a taina, make a claim, and then go back and modify that claim, agrees that sometimes when your initial claim is so explicit, you can't go back and modify it. You can't go back and modify it. Okay. Furthermore, vehecha dehavakai beidina. Furthermore, some other carve-outs, some other exceptions to this rule. Vehecha dehavakai beidina velotan. Well, so listen to this. What happens if Reuven and Shimon were standing in Beis Din? Right, we're standing in Beis Din, and let's say again, Shimon didn't make his taina. I'm sorry, they were standing in Beis Din. So let's say again, Reuven and Shimon were standing in Beis Din, and Shimon didn't make his taina. So, and now what happens? So we'll say, watch this. So here's what happened. So Reuven and Shimon are standing in Beis Din, right? Same case. Right? Shimon's living on the land. Reuven says, get off the land. Shimon, this belongs to my forefathers. Shimon said, it belonged to my forefathers. And then what happened? They leave Beis Din, and they come back. And Shimon says, I want to modify my previous statement. I didn't literally mean that it's my forefathers. I meant, again, I bought it from Reuven's forefathers, but it's so cemented and embedded in my family that as if it belonged to my forefathers. So if Shimon comes back with this new claim after leaving Beis Din, everyone agrees that ultimately, again, so the Gemara says, Eino chozer v'toin. Everyone agrees, even Ula will agree, he doesn't have the right to modify his claim. Why not? My taima, ta'anasya agmare. What are we concerned about? That Shimon left Bentzion, and what happened? His chevra met him afterwards, right? His buddies met him afterwards, and they say, Shimon, here's what you need to do. And they gave him a strategy in which to go ahead and modify his claim. In other words, the optics of it, in other words, it's one thing. I will say, essentially, Ula will say like this. It's one thing that will give you a license to modify your claim while you're standing in Bentzion. Okay, we'll allow for that. Again, obviously within reason. But to make a claim in Bentzion, then to leave, only to come back afterwards and then modify your claim, that just looks weird. It looks like something is up with that, and therefore, again, we're not going to believe you. Fine, that's Ula. Umod in Ardoim, but I'll say even the Ardoim. Now remember, the Ardoim said, Eino toin v'chozer v'toin. The Ardoim said, once you make a claim in Bentzion, once you have your claim is your claim. And that is it. You cannot go back and modify it. But even the Ardoim agree, so listen to this. The Ardoim agree in a case of Osai that where Shimon were to say to Reuven, yes, it went ahead and belonged to my forefathers who bought it from your forefathers. So even the Ardoim would agree with this type of modification. In other words, because here, essentially what the Ardoim are saying is, you can't have a modification that in any way contradicts your initial statement. So, when Shimon originally says, the field belonged to my forefathers, and now he comes along and says, well, what I really meant was, the field belonged to your forefathers, but I bought it, and it was such a cemented and solid deal that it is as if it's been in my family for generations. So then our Ardoim are like, come on, stop it. You're turning your previous statement on its head. That they don't believe. But if Shimon were to say like this, Reuven, it was your forefathers. Yeah, I'll be molded to that. But my forefathers bought it from your forefathers, and I've been consuming it all these years of chazaka. Then Ardoim would entertain a modification like that. Why? Because it doesn't contradict the original statement. Because Shimon is still standing by his original word that it belonged to my forefathers. He's just adding in an additional piece of information that my forefathers bought it from your forefathers. Okay, so now Ardoim can entertain that type of modification. Vegh, another interesting exception over there. Vegh dishtay mili avroi v'lo tan v'asan lebeidina v'tan. Now watch this. What happened? Furthermore, then Ardoim agree in the following case. Reuven and Shimon are having this outside of Bentzion. Right? They're having this argument outside of Bentzion. And Reuven saying to Shimon, get off my land. It's my land, right? It belonged to my forefathers. And Shimon saying, no, it belonged to my forefathers. But they're having this argument in Bentzion. Now they walk into Bentzion. V'asala beidina v'ta'an. And now when they walk into Bentzion, Shimon says, really, what I meant was that Reuven, it did belong to your forefathers, but I bought it from your forefathers. So now again, there was one argument that Shimon advanced outside of Bentzion, just said it was my forefathers, and he clarified that argument, or he modified that argument inside of Bentzion. Even the Ardoim agree, the Gemara says, the chozer v'toin, that he's allowed to modify his claim. Why? My taima, this is very interesting. Avid inishtalo magli ta'ana se'el lebeidina. It is common for people not to reveal their full legal claim outside of Bentzion. Right? In other words, we'll say that this actually makes a lot of sense. That halacha l'maisa, the Ardoim recognize that people get into disputes all of the time. Right? So that people get into arguments outside of Bentzion. So I know that this is headed to Bentzion. I'm not going to play my hand. In other words, I'm not going to put out there my entire legal strategy now when we get to Bentzion. So therefore, again, Reuven and Shimon are arguing about this outside of Bentzion. Reuven says it belongs to my forefathers. Shimon said it belongs to my forefathers. Then they get to Bentzion, and Shimon says, well, Reuven actually belonged to your forefathers, but I bought it from them. Halacha l'maisa, even the Ardoim, who normally say Eino toin v'chozer v'toin, would agree that in this case Shimon is permitted to modify his statement. Why? Because the truth is, it's not even really such a modification. Because in a legal proceeding, what people say outside of Bentzion is not necessarily material. But the point over here is that Ardoim will agree that it's common for people not to reveal their full legal strategy outside of Bentzion. Incredible. Amar Meimar. So Meimar said, by the way, Ana Narda Ana. I am a member. I'm from Narda. Usvirli Nebos, and I remember again the Ardoim were on record as saying, Eino toin v'chozer v'toin. Once you make your claim in Beis Din, you cannot modify it. So comes Amimer and he says, I'm from Narda, usvir lan de toin v'chozer v'toin. And I hold that a person is permitted to modify their statement. I will say, so again, remember, just want to be clear. Even according to Ula, who says, toin v'chozer v'toin, remember, it's within reason, right? In other words, you can't do something that is an explicit contradiction, really only just a more nuanced modification / contradiction. So Amemra comes along and says, I'm from Narda, and I say toin v'chozer v'toin, and I will say, what's the halacha v'hilchasa? Toin v'chozer v'toin. And the halacha is that a litigant is permitted to go ahead and modify his initial statement. So I will say, so listen to the Rambam over here. So the Rambam writes, this is in Hilchos Toin V'nitan, Perek Tes Vav Halacha Vav. There's actually two halachas over here. So listen to this. The Rambam quotes this case. It's fascinating. Zeh omer shalavosa v'zeh omer shalavosai. Zeh hevi edim shi shalavosa v'zeh hevi edim shach l'shnei chazaka. So I'll say, so again, it's this exact case. Reuven comes along and says, this field belongs to my father, or belonged to my fathers. And he brought witnesses to that. Shimon says it belonged to my fathers, right? But Shimon only brings witnesses to say that's what? To say that, only that he's been there for the years of Chazaka. He doesn't bring witnesses to the fact that it belonged to his forefathers. So we'll say, so what's talacha? So the Gemara says, Tachzra lezeh shehevi edim shishal avosav v'yachzra pero shachal shahari lo tan klum ve'in achilas aray shakol chazak shin matayna ala bailim in a klum. They both say, so the Rambam happens to point out over here something that the Gemara didn't do, which is actually quite fascinating. So how do you pass it in that case? But before we get to modifications, how do you pass it in that case, right? Reuven says, the land belongs to my fathers, right? And he brings witnesses to that. Shimon says, the land belongs to my fathers. But Shimon doesn't bring witnesses to back up that claim. Instead, what does Shimon bring witnesses to do? What do those witnesses testify? That he's been there for 3 years. The Rambam says, who wins that case? Who wins that case? The answer is, Reuven wins that case. Reuven, the ones who brings witnesses that his forefathers owned it, wins the case. Why? Because we'll say, this is fast, like we said before. In order for chazaka to work, chazaka works with two components. Number one, residency requirement. That's number one. And number two, a taina, a claim. You have to make a claim and be able to support a claim about how that land became yours. Saying you lived there for 3 years is not enough. You lived there for 3 years, and how did you get it? How did you get it? So the problem is, in this case over here, Shimon's claiming, how did he get it? How did he get it? It's ancestral property. Only one problem, which is, he can't back it up. So therefore, again, interestingly enough, Reuven can back it up that belongs to his family. Shimon, all he has is residency with no claim. Therefore, Reuven wins, Shimon loses. That's the halach over there. And Shimon has to vacate the premises, give it back to Reuven, and pay Reuven back for anything he consumed of that land for all of those years. Incredible. Now, but that's not really the case that intrigues us. Now, but here we go. Chazr zeh machzik v'amar kein shalavosecha haisa va'ata machartali v'zeh shatanti tchil shalavosek lomar shani somech ala. So we'll say, what happens if Shimon comes along and Shimon modifies his original claim? Shimon comes along and says, you know what, Reuven, you're right. The field did belong to your forefathers. But either again, the Rambam's version, Shimon's claiming your forefathers sold it to me, or Reuven, you sold it to me, so now there's a taina. What's the halacha? Good. Hari zutaina nechona shaharid nasan amasla lidvarav harishonim uma'amidim osabiyado. If Shimon comes along and modifies his claim, and Shimon says, you know what, I didn't really mean that it actually belonged to my forefathers. Rather, I meant that it's as cemented as if it belonged to my forefathers. Because Reuven, your forefathers sold it to me, or Reuven, you yourself sold it to me, the Rambam says, we believe Shimon. Because now Shimon has two things. He has the chazaka residency, and he has the taina, the claim. So we'll say, what do you see? The Rambam Paskins, toein v'chozer v'toein. Incredible. That a person is believed to modify the claim basis. Now, the Rambam happens to bring down the same exception as the Gemara said, which is, obviously this is within reason. So for example, like the Rambam says, if Shimon were to say, Reuven, this field only belonged to my forefathers and not your forefathers, that level of explicit kite, right? So you can't backpedal that. You can't backpedal that. The Jews say it's almost like a good muster in terms of being careful with using too explicit of terms when especially we get to this, like when we get angry, right? They say something like just like explicit. I'll never. Again, it's hard to walk back I'll never statements. It's hard to walk back explicit statements. So therefore, again, the Rama Paskins, toin v'chozer v'toin. So we'll say, so that's the halacha l'maisa. I'll also tell you hashkafa l'maisa. Hashkafa l'maisa, we'll say, this is a tremendous yisod. What does it mean that we paskin hashkafa l'maisa, chozer v'toin v'chozer v'toin? And we'll say, you know what, in life, you could change your mind. In life, you could change your mind. So often in life we get backed in, right? We create like a persona for ourselves. And we create, I do this and I don't do this. And you know, it happens that sometimes there are parts of my personality that I've created that as I get older I recognize, you know what? They're not right. They're not right. This is not the right approach. Sometimes, again, I must say, you know, sometimes in life a hashkaf, an outlook that I had when I was young, doesn't work when I get older. Either because it was wrong the whole time, or sometimes, again, just life changes, we change, and approaches and strategies and midos and behaviors that perhaps worked when I was younger do not work now. But so often, because we are creatures of habit, we become so entrenched in who we are and what we are that we don't permit ourselves to change. Right? This is it, love it or leave it. So how do we paskin? Tell him the chozer v'toin. You can change your mind. You can change your mind. It's okay. But you said this. I know I said that. But you know what? Now I'm saying something different. And what's the halacha? And I was saying the difference. There's a difference in the halacha and the hashkafa. You see, in the halacha, you're only permitted to modify your initial statement so much. In hashkafa, you could change your initial stance as much as you want. We're not locked into anything, I was saying. If you want to change something about yourself, even you espoused this, you did this, you proclaimed this, it's okay to say, I've changed my mind. We're so often scared. We back ourselves in, we dig ourselves in, and we entrench ourselves into ideas, into hashkafas, into outlooks that might or may not have worked in the past. And now I realize this is not right for me now. But for whatever the reason, the ability to say, I've changed my mind, or I've changed my approach, for some reason it's so scary and so daunting and so overwhelming. Just remember, halacha l'maisa and hashkafa l'maisa, toin v'chozer v'toin. It's okay to modify things. It's okay to affect change. And it's okay to change your mind. Incredible. All right, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Zeh omer shalavosai v'zeh omer shalavosai. So we'll say another case. These are great cases. So Zeh omer shalavosai v'zeh omer shalavosai. Hi, I see sadi da'avasa va'achli shnei chazakas. Listen to this. Similar, ostensibly at first glance, same case. Reuven says, this field belonged to my forefathers. Now Rashi adds in over here. I'm sorry, the Bach adds in over here. Zeh omer shalavosai va'achlosei shnei chazaka. Bezeh omer shalavosai va'achlosei shnei chazaka. So I'll say, so now in this case, they're both adding in another component. Reuven is saying, the field belonged to my forefathers, and I have also been here for the last 3 years. I've used it for the years of chazaka. Shimon's claiming, Zeh omer shalavosai. And Shimon's also claiming, it belonged to my forefathers, and I also have been using it for the years of chazaka. Now remember, this is different than the first case. In the first case, Reuven was claiming this belonged to my forefathers, but Reuven didn't have any residency. Shimon claimed it belonged to my forefathers, and Shimon had residency. In this case, Reuven is claiming it belonged to my forefathers, and I have residency. Shimon's claiming it belonged to my forefathers, and I have residency. Okay, here's where it gets interesting. Hi, I see sahad davase va'achla shnei chazaka. V'hai I see sahadi da'achla shnei chazaka. Reuven brings witnesses that attest to both statements. Number one, that the field belonged to his forefathers, and number two, that Reuven's been there for 3 years. Shimon brings witnesses for what? Chazaka, for residency, but not to solidify the fact that his forefathers own the field. So what do? This is great. Rav Nachman says, okay, it's actually pretty simple. Uki achila labhadi achila, v'uki ara becheskas avasa. So essentially, Rav Nachman says, well, let's just line up the testimonies against each other, right? So what do they both have? So Reuven has testimony that he's been used it for the years of chazaka, and Shimon has testimony that he's used it for the years of chazaka. So what does that competing testimony do? What do they do? Well, they cancel each other out. So essentially, that level of testimony is gone. So what are we left with? Because we'll say anytime you have just two contradictory sets of witnesses, essentially the Bentzion just says, okay, it's like neither of you exist, like you cancel each other out. So therefore, again, because Reuven has a testimony that says he's been there the last 3 years, Shimon has testimony he's been there the last 3 years. Okay, Chevra, there's nothing we can do about that. Let's throw that out. So what are we left with? We're left with testimony that the field belonged to Reuven's ancestors. So essentially, Rav Nachman says it's as if all we have in this case are witnesses that say that Reuven's forefathers owned the field, and therefore what? Reuven is the owner. That's it. Resolved. Amalei Rava said, what are you talking about? Ha'idus mucheshasi. No. You can't do that. This is contradictory, or this is contradicted or refuted testimony. In other words, both sides. Here's what's interesting. What Rav Nachman is doing is, he's almost looking at it as two different layers of eidos. There's a layer of testimony about who owned it previously, and then there's a layer of testimony about residency. Right? So Rav Nachman is saying is we knock out the residency level, and all you're left with ultimately is the historical piece, right? That it belonged to Reuven's forefathers. Rava says, what are you talking about? A testimonial unit is a testimonial unit. In other words, when Reuven's witnesses come along and they say, Reuven's forefathers own this land and Reuven's been living here for 3 years, you can't splice that testimony. That is one testimonial unit. Therefore, once one part of the testimony is knocked off or refuted, essentially what does that do? That invalidates the entire testimony. We've seen this, we know this from Makkah, right? Eido Shabbat al-Miksasabat lakula, without getting into this right now. So essentially, Rava says, this is a refuted testimony. So therefore, essentially, Rava says, in this case, we have no testimony. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Kevan dahani beis kidos machisho zeza. Since these two groups of witnesses contradict each other, so again, we'll say, here's what we know. See, here's what's fascinating. They'll say, when you have these two sets of witnesses contradicting each other, right? Reuven's witness is saying that Reuven's been living there for the last 3 years. Shimon's witness is saying that Shimon's living there the last 3 years. What do you know for sure? What? Someone's lying, right? Again, so I'll say, so therefore, again, what we know is there is one group of witnesses here that are liars. As such, Rava says, you can't accept anything that any of these witnesses say because you don't know who is the lying group. Therefore, again, you want to say, Rav Nachman, you want to say, but Reuven is left with testimony that his forefathers owned this field. No, he's not. Because essentially, these two witnesses, these two groups have totally canceled each other out, and you are left with no testimony. Ha'edus mucheshasi. Amar Leis, Rav Nachman responds, so again, Rav Nachman says, but 1 second, it's true that they've refuted each other regarding residency. Amar Beis. Bavosa mi'eschachish. Have they refuted each other regarding historical ownership? In other words, remember again, Shimon's witnesses made no mention about Shimon's forefathers owning it. Reuven's witnesses made mention of Reuven's forefathers' historical ownership. So Rav Nachman said, so it's a fundamental machlokes over here. It's almost as if Rav is coming along and saying the testimonial unit is the testimonial unit, and once they are essentially refuted on one count, they're refuted on all counts. Or I shouldn't say refuted, is the wrong word. It's a better word than refuted. Cancelled. Muchashas. Contradicted. Essentially rendered useless. And Rav Nachman says, I don't understand. Why can't you look at it as two different forms of testimony? While it's true that they're contradicted regarding chazaka years, they're not contradicted regarding historical ownership. So it could very well be that Rava and Rav Nachman have the same machlokes as Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. So we'll say, listen to this. The itmar is actually quite beautiful. So we'll say, so just to keep our cases and to keep case clear over here. Reuven and Shimon, right? Reuven is claiming this field belonged to my father and I've been here for 3 years. Shimon's claiming the field belonged to my father and I've been here for 3 years. Reuven produces witnesses that back up both of his claims, that it belonged to his fathers and that he'd been here 3 years. Shimon only produces witnesses that claim that he's been here for 3 years. So what do? So Rav Nachman says it's very simple. The testimony regarding residency cancels each other out. All you're left with is the testimony of Reuven's witnesses that Reuven's father owned the field, therefore the field goes to Reuven. Rava says, what are you talking about? Once they refute each other regarding residency, the whole eidos is thrown out because we know someone's lying. Once we know someone's lying, we don't really have the ability to go ahead and accept any part of anyone's testimony because we don't know who's lying. Therefore, again, there's no testimony. And I was saying, now, by the way, you'll say to yourself, so what do you do, by the way, in a case like that? So what do you do now in the testimony? So we're going to talk about this later on, that sometimes what halacha has is halacha kind of says, okay, we're just going to drop this in the middle, and you guys duke this out, right? Called the Olam Gvar, we'll talk about whoever stronger wins. Sometimes the halacha can't come up with a reasonable conclusion, but we'll see that in just a moment. So what says, the Gemara suggests that the machlokes Rava and Rav Nachman is the same machlokes ultimately again of Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. What happened with Rav Huna and Rav Chisda? Here we go. The Itmar, both say 3 lines down from the top on 31 Bilam Dal from the base. The Itmar, base Kite Edim Hamachisho Zu. Let's say you have 2 groups of witnesses that are contradicting each other. They will say, now Rashi gives the example over here. Look at Rashi. Hamachishos Zu says Rashi, Be'edos Achas, Kegon, Shnaim Omrim Ploni Lava Mi Ploni Mana, or Shnaim Achirim Hamachishim Amru Lo Lava Mimeno Klum. Schreiber Osayom Sha'atem Omrim Shalava Mimeno, Haya Imanu, Haya Imanu Alova, Kol Osayom, Velo Lava Mishum Adam Klum, or Be'edos, so now watch this. So now, right, set of witnesses, number 1 say, we saw Ruvain borrow $1,000 from Shimon. Group of on Friday. Witnesses number 2 says, what are you talking about? Reuben was with us the entire day Friday, and he did not borrow anything from anyone. He was with us. So we'll say, so therefore again, the 2 sets of witnesses are contradicting each other. Rashi says, Ube'edus kazeh lo hemina TORAH achronim yosem min harishonim. So therefore, again, 2 sets of witnesses that are contradicting each other. So group 1 says Reuven borrowed from Shimon $1,000. Group 2 says impossible. Reuven was with us the entire day on Friday. He didn't borrow from anyone anything. So what's the halacha? Amar Rava. So Amar Rav Huna says like this: Zuba b'fnei atzmo umida, v'zuba b'fnei atzmo umida. So we'll say. So obviously, in this case, these 2 sets of witnesses cancel each other out. Do these sets of witnesses have the ability to testify elsewhere? Right? In other words, let's say they come to Beis Din, group 1 comes to Beis Din to testify about a totally unrelated case. Rav Huna says, yes, these groups, as much as they cancel each other out, these groups have the ability to go ahead and testify in different cases. In other words, Rav Huna says, as much as they cancel each other out, right, they contradict each other, neither set of groups of witnesses are pasul. They're not pasul. Rav Chisda says, what are you talking about? What do we need to do with such lying witnesses? In other words, Rav Chisda says, what are you talking about? Someone's lying here. Someone's lying in this case, right? Group 1 says Reuven borrowed $1,000 from Shimon. Group 2 says, impossible, Reuven was with us the entire day. Now I both say, now we don't know who's lying, but one thing we absolutely know, which is someone's lying. Someone's lying. And I both say, it's always interesting, because we have this concept, of being down the kafskos, of always giving the benefit of the doubt. Right? So you should say over here, I don't know, maybe no one's lying. Right? Maybe at the end of the day, maybe the Shimon and Reuven has a twin brother, and he was there, and it was this. So also there's a klal that you're dan lekaf zchus, not dan lekaf shtos. In other words, that you have to give the benefit of the doubt. But at the same time, when someone's lying, they're lying. They're lying. It's very important, because otherwise, if you're always down the kaf zchus, even when it's clear that a person doesn't believe the benefit of the doubt, that's just being foolish and naive in the journey of life. So you have to know when to give the benefit of the doubt, and you also have to know at the end of the day when to know that someone is lying. Someone is lying. So in this case over here, so Chisda comes along and says, I don't understand. How can you believe them in any other case? Again, I don't know who's lying, but here's what I do know. Someone's lying. Someone's lying. So because someone is lying and I don't know who is lying, halachically, I have no choice but to believe neither of them. And therefore, again, neither of these groups of witnesses are permitted to give testimony in any other case, even independently of each other. So the Gemara says, so this is interesting. So the Gemara wants to line this up. Lema, Rav Nachman Damar Rav Huna. So we'll say, now watch this. So Rav Nachman, remember again, going back to our case, what did Rav Nachman say? Rav Nachman said, let Reuven and Shimon's witnesses cancel each other out in terms of residency. And what you're left with are Ruvain's witnesses' testimony regarding the fact that it belonged to Ruvain's father, and let's let that stand. So it must be that's Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman holds like Rav Huna. Just like Rav Huna says that in this case over here, the witnesses, even though they cancel each other out, they can testify in other cases. In other words, because Rav Huna and Rav Nachman are both saying that halacha l'maisa, just because there's refuted testimony doesn't automatically make anyone into a comprehensive liar. The Rava could have chista, and Rav who says that no. Once part of the testimony is refuted, this entire unit becomes inadmissible. So he'll say like Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says so too in this case, in our case over there. We just quoted over here about Reuven borrowing from Shimon. Once someone's a liar, they can't give testimony anywhere. To which the Gemara says no. Aliba de Rav Chisda kuli amalo pligi. According to Rav Chisda, everyone agrees. Ki pligi, so there's a machlokes come up. Aliba de Rav Huna. The machlokes only comes up according to Rav Huna. Why? Well, so now watch this. Now remember, Rav Huna was the one who said that halacha l'maisa in this case, even though again, group number one is saying Reuven borrowed $1,000 from Shimon. Group number two is saying Reuven was with us the entire day, couldn't have borrowed anything. So Rav Huna says that halacha l'maisa, as much as now none of this testimony is admissible because they cancel each other out, neither of these groups are established as liars, and therefore again they could each go ahead and give testimony in different circumstances. So keep ligeli yid Rav Huna. Here we go. Rav Nachman to Rav Huna. So we'll say Rav Nachman of our case holds like Rav Huna. That's what Rav Nachman says. Going back to our Chazaka case, Rav Nachman says that Reuven and Shimon's witnesses cancel each other out in terms of residency, right? Because both Reuven and Shimon are bringing testimony that they both lived in the land for 3 years. Okay, so that testimony cancels each other out. But Reuven still has the testimony that says that the land belonged to his forefathers. So therefore, again, Rav Nachman of our previous case will align himself like Rav Huna. The Rava will say like this. Rava will say like this. The truth is, Ad kan lo kama Rav Huna elo le'edus acheres. They will say, let's be clear what's happening over here. What is Rav Huna giving a license for? Rav Huna saying is like this, right? Let's go back, right? Group of witnesses, one come along and say that Reuven borrowed $1,000 from Shimon, and group number two are saying that Reuven was with us the entire day, and therefore he couldn't have done it. So Rav says, so now Rav Huna says that both of those groups are permitted to give testimony in other situations. Neither of them are established to be liars, so as to preclude them from giving testimony in Beis Din. They can't give testimony now; their testimony is meaningless, but in other cases they can. But listen to this. So Rava says, "Istafka in other cases, avala oseidus lo." But obviously, anything regarding this case right now in front of us, they're totally disqualified. Rava says, going back to our case in Amud Aleph, what are we talking about? We'll say we're talking about utilizing part of the testimony within the same testimony. Remember, I will say, what's our case on Amud Aleph? Our case is Reuven is bringing witnesses that say that the land belonged to his forefathers and he ate it for the years of Chazakah. Shimon's bringing witnesses that it belonged to his forefathers and he ate it for the years of Chazakah. So that's Shimon's claim, right? But what happens? Shimon's witnesses only support that he ate it for the years of Chazakah. So so the Gemara was suggesting let the residency cancel each other out, and let Reuven's witnesses claim that it belonged to his forefathers stand. So Rava said even Rav Huna, who believes with these witnesses, only believes them, contradicted witnesses, only believes them in a different case, but doesn't believe them in the same case. So Rava says over here in Amud Aleph, you're talking about believing the historical eidos within the same case after they've been refuted for the residency part of that case. So Rava says even Rav Huna would not agree with that. Avala osa eidos lo. Okay, incredible. So I'll say, so now, therefore, again, so we're left with Ramachlokis over about what happens. Now, this case is also a further evolving case. Watch this. Hadra Aisi Sadi Davase. So watch, it's very exciting. So let's go back. Now we're back to Madalef over here. So right, Reuven's claiming this land belonged to my father and I've been living here 3 years. Shimon claims this land belonged to my forefathers and I've been living here for 3 years. Reuven brings witnesses that support that it belonged to his father and he's been living here 3 years. And Shimon brings witnesses that he's been living here 3 years. So now Machlokes, Rav Nachman and Rava, what do we do? Rav Nachman says, give the field to Reuven, because Reuven is the only one who has a piece of testimony still standing. Rava says, no, this whole thing is cancelled out. The witnesses contradict each other, therefore it's as if neither of them has any testimony. Okay, further evolving case. Hadra Aisi Sadi Davasi. Watch this. Now, Shimon brings in additional witnesses. Developing story. Shimon brings in additional witnesses that in fact the field belonged to him, to his fathers. So Rabbi says, now Shimon also has witnesses that the field belongs to his house. So what do we do? Amar Rav Nachman, Anan achsine anan mesakina le lezilusa de beidina lo chayshinan. So I'll say, so now here's what's interesting. Now remember, Rav Nachman himself is fascinating. What did Rav Nachman say in the first iteration? In the first iteration, Rav Nachman awarded the field to Ruvain. Why did Rav Nachman award the field to Ruvain? Why? Because Ruvain was the one who had testimony that it belonged to his forefathers, right? Because they each had testimony about Chazaka, therefore that cancels each other out. And in Rav Nachman's view, all that was left was testimony regarding history, historical ownership. Ruvain had it, therefore the field belonged to Ruvain. Now watch this. Now Shimon comes along and Shimon brings witnesses that it belonged to his forefathers. So what do? Rav Nachman says, well now we have to take the field back from Ruvain. Why? Because now they both have the same testimony. The testimonies go ahead and cancel each other out. And so effectively, Bentzion could award the field to neither of them. So therefore, essentially, the exact question over here is the same Bentzion. Ana achsinon, we placed Ruvain in that field. Ana maskinon lei. We'll remove Ruvain from that field. And we can't be worried about the degradation of Bentzion. I was about to say, it doesn't look good for Bentzion when Bentzion makes a ruling and then undoes that ruling, reverses that ruling. So there is a mindset that says, that sometimes Rabbi say, this is interesting, sometimes that the integrity of Bentzion must be maintained, even if it comes at the expense of, it's going to sound strange, of a pure, correct legal ruling in one case. In other words, the system is always more important than the individual. Because the system, right, the integrity of the system has to be maintained. But Rav Nachman says, no, we don't worry about that. We worry about the law, the halacha. So therefore, again, we placed Ruvain in this field because in our last iteration, Ruvain had historical testimony, Shimon did not. Therefore, Ruvain was the owner. Now Shimon brings historical testimony. They have equal halachic footing. We put Ruvain in there. We're going to take Ruvain out. And now again, neither has a valid claim to the field. And we are not worried about Bentzion. I will say, Rashi points out over here, this is what we said before. We'll talk about what does that mean when you take Ruvain out. So I will say, we're going to see this concept that when neither person could go ahead and advance a claim, and they're both claiming ownership, we have this concept of kol da'alam gvar. Whoever's stronger gets it. But we'll clarify that later. Massive Rava. So Rava comes along. Rav Zira. How can you say that? Shnaim omrim meis, Shnaim omrim lo meis. Listen to this. We'll say, almost back to our Yevamos days. Or Ksuvas days. So two people say about a particular woman, right? Rachel's married to Ruvain. Two witnesses come along and say Ruvain died. Ushnayim omrim lo meis. Two witnesses say no, Ruvain's alive. Shnayim omrim nisgarsha. Two witnesses say Ruvain divorced Rachel. Ushnayim omrim lo nisgarsha. Two witnesses say he did not divorce Rachel. So I'll say, so what does Rachel do in these cases? Harizu lo tinase. She should not marry. Makes sense. In other words, you have a contradictory witness testimony. Don't marry. But if she did marry, she does not have to go ahead and leave her current husband. Interesting. Rashi says over here, it's in the wide lines, about 8 lines in. The evet in lechatchila lo. So we'll say, so again, she should not marry under these circumstances, obviously because you have contradictory witnesses. But Allah Chlamais, if she did marry, we do not make her leave husband number 2. Rav Nachman Rabbi Yossi Omer Teisei. And Rabbi Yossi says, absolutely not. If she remarried under these circumstances, she absolutely has to leave husband number 2. Rabbi Yossi, Masai, when is that so? A Masai ani Omer Teisei, Bizman Shaba'u Eidim V'achar Kach Nises. Well, I will say, when is this? When ultimately, again, the witnesses came first and then she got married. In other words, we'll say, if witnesses say that her husband died, right, and she got married, so then, and now, she got married, and now another set of witnesses come and say that, no, your husband's alive and well, we don't force her to get divorced in that kind of case. But, if both sets of witnesses, the one that say that her husband died and the one that say that her husband didn't die, both came, and then she still got married, we're going to make her leave husband number 2. You should not have gotten married under those circumstances. Amrle. So Nachman said to Rava, so we'll say, so the point over here is, what do you see from here? What you see from here, we'll say, from this last statement over here is, we are concerned for the integrity of Bentzion. In other words, if witnesses came and said to Rachel, your husband died, right? And therefore Bentzion said, based on that you could remarry. And she married. And now witnesses come along and say, no, your husband is alive and well. Bentzion does not make her get divorced. Right? Why? Because I will say, that doesn't look right for the integrity of Beis Din to keep on reversing decisions. So what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, we are concerned about the integrity of Beis Din. That's the point. You see here, so what we see over here is something fascinating, which is a general idea about, are we concerned with the integrity of Beis Din or not? Rav Nachman seems to say that if new information comes, Beis Din will reverse their previous decision. It doesn't look good for Beis Din. Okay, delivering the proper verdict, or the proper halacha, is more important than the integrity of Beis Din. Comes along Rava, and Rava says, no, you see from here, we are careful about the integrity of Beis Din because we have to uphold the integrity of the system. Right? We'll say, we'll have to stop over here. We'll stop over for today. It's a little bit of the middle of the story. But again, we're leaving off in the middle of this. This is case 2, part 2. I know I'm leaving a little bit on the cliffhanger over here. Case 2, part 2. New information regarding history. Do we reverse the previous psak or not? This is rooted in a fundamental machlokes. Are we concerned with denigrating the image of Beis Din? Machlokes Rav Nachman Rava. Resolution tomorrow. Shkoyach.